Greta survives inside Ironveil's cold stone walls as a simple healer, invisible by design, careful by necessity. For 10 years, she has been no one. No name, no past, no reflection she could afford to let the wrong eyes see. Because the Sanctum of the Burning Veil is hunting the last of her kind, and the moment they find her, she dies. Then the king returns from war with an arrowhead lodged in his shoulder, and no one able to remove it. Caelan Duskmore, Alpha King, the most dangerous man in Aethermoor, ends up sitting on her stool, in her apothecary, close enough that she can feel the wolf beneath his skin. She removes the arrow. She controls herself. She survives the encounter. But when he stands to leave, he pauses at the door and says 4 words that unravel 10 years of careful hiding. Your shadow. Look down. So why, when he clearly knows something is wrong, does he protect her instead of turning her in? Stay with us to find out. The answer will change everything you think you know about this story. The steam from the clay cup curled upward and vanished before it reached the stone ceiling. Greta wrapped both hands around the warmth of it, watching the surface of the liquid settle. Valerian root, silver bark moss, 2 drops of something she had no name for in any human tongue. The recipe was hers alone. The herbs grew on the narrow ledge outside the apothecary window. 7 small clay pots arranged with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with human habit, and everything to do with instinct older than this kingdom. She looked down into the cup. For a breath, only a breath, the reflection that looked back was not entirely her own. A flicker of silver where her irises should have been, clean as moonlight on still water. Then gone, human again. Brown and tired and 28 years old. Good. She took the first sip. Stay that way. The apothecary was the lowest room in Ironveil, not by accident. She had chosen it herself on her second day, citing the root cellar air as better for dried herbs. No one had questioned her. No one ever questioned the quiet healer girl who kept to herself and whose hands somehow made wounds close faster than they should. People accepted small miracles when they were convenient. They only started asking questions when miracles grew inconvenient. Outside the narrow window, the birch forest that ringed the castle stood bone-white against a pale gray sky. Northern autumn, the kind of morning that smelled of iron and coming snow. She turned back to her pots. 10 years ago, she had walked through Ironveil's servants' gate with nothing. No name, no past, no reflection in any surface she couldn't control. She told them she was an orphan from the coastal settlements. She told them she knew herbs. Both things were true enough. What she did not tell them, that her name was not Marin, that the night she arrived was the same night the sky above the eastern forest had burned silver and then gone dark forever. What she did not tell them, that she had a sister once, that her sister had pressed both hands to Greta's sternum in the dark, said, "Run," and then turned back toward the sound of fire and screaming. Seraphel saved me. The thought came as it always did, flat, rehearsed, a stone worn smooth from handling. And then Seraphel chose to survive by any means necessary. And now I do not know which of those 2 things defines her. 5 years ago, Caelan Duskmore had taken the throne of Aethermoor. He was 21. His father had died in the night, of causes that the court physicians would not put in writing. The new king was young and cold, and by all accounts controlled his wolf bond with a discipline that frightened the older lords more than any display of power would have. From the day he arrived, Greta had felt it, a pull, low in her sternum, like a compass needle swinging toward north. She had no explanation for it that she was willing to examine, so she stopped examining it. She began taking different routes to the Great Hall. She stopped attending the monthly court healings. She rearranged her schedule so she was never in the east corridor when his guard changed. 5 years of careful navigation. She had become very good at invisible. Before the castle woke, she went down. The sub-cellar beneath Ironveil's foundations smelled of old hay and wood smoke, and something else. Something faintly luminous that she recognized, the way she recognized her own breathing. She carried a satchel. The children were already awake. They were always awake before dawn. It was one of the signs. There were 7 of them, ages ranging from perhaps 4 to perhaps 11. The eldest, a boy named Tam, who had shown signs she could not yet explain. Fevers that came with silver light and left him pale and shaking. They were the castle's abandoned, foundlings, children of servants who had died, children no one could account for. No one came down here except her. Marin. The youngest, a girl called Pip, ran to her with the particular urgency of very small children. "My eye is doing the thing again." Greta crouched down and looked. Silver. Just a thread of it, like a vein of quartz in gray stone, running through the brown of the iris. My fault. She had known it for years, the slow leakage of her own essence, invisible to everyone except those sensitive enough to absorb it. She had tried to seal herself more tightly. It was like trying to seal a river with her hands. "I know," she said quietly, and placed her palm against the side of Pip's face. Something warm moved from her hand into the child. Not her own essence, but a stabilizing pressure, like pressing a bandage to a seam. "Better?" Pip nodded. "It doesn't hurt." "I know." "It won't." She looked at them, all 7 faces ranging from sleepy to solemn. This was why she had not run when her instinct screamed at her to run. This was why she had stayed 5 years longer than was safe. She could not leave them with something inside them that had no name and no guardian. She was sorting dried silverwort on the high counter when Brother Aldrich came through the door fast enough to rattle the hanging bundles of yarrow. He was a big man for his age, white-haired, with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent his 50s outdoors. He had been Ironveil's chief physician for 20 years. He was also, she had come to understand, the only person in the castle who had decided that what he did not know could not hurt him, and meant it as kindness rather than cowardice. "The king is back," he said. 3 days early. The silverwort fell still under her hands. They said the northern campaign ended in a victory. Aldrich was pulling his outer robe straight, already moving. "There will be guests. We'll need to double the infirmary stores, and I need you to—" "I'll handle it," she said. He paused, looked at her. He had a way of not asking questions that was its own form of asking. "I'm fine," she said. "I am not fine." The pull in her sternum was sharper already, even through the distance of stone and corridor. 5 years of careful avoidance, and her body was already responding to his proximity like a flower turning toward a light source it had no business turning toward. The problem, she thought, is not his power. It is the way he looks at me, as though he is reading something I have not finished writing. She went back to her silverwort. She noticed it first in old Benedict's hand. He came for his weekly joint wrapping. Chronic inflammation, nothing remarkable. She unwound the old bandage, pressed her fingers to the knuckles, and felt the familiar, gentle channeling of warmth from her skin to his. When she lifted her hand, the linen she'd used for the new wrapping had a small blue flower pressed into it. Not a real flower, a shape in the weave, as though something had crystallized there. Benedict didn't notice. She smoothed the linen flat. 3 weeks. She counted back. 3 weeks since the last time her seal had held perfectly. The flowers had started small, just impressions, like frost fern on glass. They were getting clearer. She went to the window and looked out at the birch forest. Through the white trunks, the road from the northern pass was visible. A long line of horses and riders, moving fast. The king's banner, black over gray, snapped in the wind at the front of the column. Even at this distance, even with walls and glass between them, something shifted in the temperature of the air. Not a sound, not a sight, but a change in pressure. The way a door opening in a far room makes a candle lean. She felt it in her sternum before she understood what it was. Her hands, she noticed, were pressed flat to the stone windowsill. She lifted them deliberately and went back to work. He arrived in her apothecary like weather, not preceded by announcement, not accompanied by the usual assembly of attendants and guardsmen and people who existed to buffer a king from inconvenient reality. Just Brother Aldrich's hand on the door, and then the room changed. The quality of the air changed. Even the light from the narrow window seemed to reorganize itself around the figure that ducked slightly to fit through the doorframe. Greta did not look up immediately. She had learned that the half-second of controlled stillness was the difference between composure and catastrophe. Focus, she told herself. He is a patient. You are a healer. These are the only relevant facts. When she did look up, he was not wearing armor. Traveling clothes, dark wool, simple cut, a collar unlaced at the throat, road dust on his shoulders, a 5-day beard, and underneath all of it, a jaw that could have been cut from the same gray granite as the castle walls. He was large in the way that certain things are large, not imposing by intention, but by simple, inevitable fact, the way a storm is large. Handsome was not the right word. Handsome implied something decorative. What she was looking at was something else entirely, carved from a harder material, belonging to a colder latitude. His left arm was held slightly away from his body. There. She refocused on the practical. The shoulder of his shirt was dark with something she recognized. "Sit down," she said, before Aldrich could speak. A pause, almost imperceptible. Then the King of Aethermoor sat down on her low wooden stool, without a word. "The arrow is still in?" she asked. "The arrowhead. The shaft broke off." "How long?" 19 hours. The same flat tone. 3 physicians in camp. None of them could extract it. The alloy resists conventional tools. "I understand." She was already moving. "White platinum with iron threading, yes? The physicians couldn't grip it because the compound reacts to ordinary metal instruments." She set her tools on the table beside him, bone-handled, not iron. "It takes 12 hours to become fully active in the tissue. You likely felt fine until this morning, and then felt considerably less fine." He looked at her then, not sharply, the way someone looks at a map they've been reading wrong. "You know what I am," he said. "You're the Alpha King of Aethermoor." She met his eyes briefly. "It's documented in the historical records. The Duskmore line has carried the wolf bond since the 9th century. She glanced back at her instruments. "I've read the castle library twice." Don't look at his eyes again, she told herself. They are gray-dark, and they do not look at things the way other people look at things. She looked at his eyes again. "This will hurt before it helps," she said. "I'm aware." She had operated on worse wounds than this, technically speaking. What made her hands careful, unnaturally, absurdly careful, was the fact that when she worked with her fingers close to a wound, she had no way to fully prevent her own nature from seeping through. She was a creature of light and living things. Her touch accelerated healing. Usually this was useful. Right now, it was a liability she could not afford. She pressed the first probe in along the tract. His jaw tightened. Nothing else moved. His scent in this moment was controlled iron, pain compressed into discipline, no release. She noted it the way she noted changes in weather. Useful information, filed away. She found the fragment, worked the tool carefully, and extracted it in one smooth motion. It came out black at the tip, where it had been absorbing his blood. She set it on the tray, reached for the clean linen, and then, her fingers made contact with the skin above the wound, and she had been careless for just one moment, one single moment of inattention. Warmth moved through her hand, against her will, against every control she had built over 10 years. She felt him go absolutely still. Not the stillness of pain, the opposite. "What," he said, very quietly, "was that?" "A common anti-inflammatory compound," she said, "applied topically." The silence that followed was the shape of a man who had spent years identifying lies, and recognized the architecture of one, but had not yet decided what to do with it. She pressed the clean linen to the wound and kept her eyes on her work. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I'm currently holding a very sharp probe 6 inches from your bloodstream. If I were afraid, you'd know." A beat. She permitted herself one slight edge of dryness. The shaking would give it away. Something in the air shifted. Not warmth exactly. Something more dangerous than warmth. "What is your name?" he said. "Marin, my lord." Marin. He tasted it the way you taste water from an unfamiliar spring, trying to identify what was in it. "That name doesn't fit you." She tied the bandage, said nothing. She was aware of the exact moment he saw it. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. A faint luminescence at the edge of his skin where her fingers had pressed. Already fading, already dissolving back into the surface of him. Like moonlight caught in ice, visible only at the right angle. His head turned very slightly, not toward her. He was still looking at his own shoulder. Then he looked up. His eyes, dark gray, the color of deep water before a storm, held something she could not read. Not fear, not the revulsion she had braced for in the half-second before she had made herself stop bracing for anything. Something else, patient and still, like the surface of a lake that knows it is deep. "Marin," he said again. "The wound will seal by morning," she said. "I'd recommend keeping it covered for the next—" "Look at me." She looked at him. Neither of them spoke. His jaw was tight. A muscle shifted there, just below the hinge. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, a wolf's instinct, reading the air. She kept her own scent controlled, neutral, cool as stone, the way she had practiced for years. She watched him decide something. 3 days, he said, instead of whatever he had been about to say. "I have a delegation arriving tomorrow, members of an organization called the Sanctum of the Burning Veil. I'd like you to serve as personal physician to the entire visiting party for the duration of their stay." "Oh, no." "My lord, I'm only the castle's—" "You're the only practitioner in this castle who just removed an anti-regeneration arrowhead without making me bleed out onto the floor," he said mildly. "I want the best attending my guests." He stood. He was taller than he had seemed sitting. Tall enough that she had to recalibrate her awareness of the room's dimensions. "And Marin." He stopped at the door. Didn't turn back. "Your shadow." She looked down. Her shadow on the stone floor stretched toward him like a hand reaching. The man who appeared in the doorway a moment later had the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to use their own quietness as a weapon. He was perhaps 30. Built compactly, with watchful eyes the color of autumn bark. He looked at Greta the way a hunting dog looks at a scent it can't quite place. Not aggressive, not friendly. Alert. "The delegation's advance riders arrived an hour ago," he said to Caelan. "I know." Caelan stepped past him. "Brennan, Marin will be attending the visitors. Make sure she has clearance for the East Wing." Brennan's eyes moved back to her. A brief survey. Hands, tools, the shadow still slightly askew on the floor. He said nothing. But his expression was the expression of a man who had added a note to a ledger he had been maintaining for some time. He already knows something, she thought. He has known something for a while. She began cleaning her instruments. Behind her, their footsteps receded down the corridor. She listened until the last echo died. She spent the evening running through her options with the methodical calm of someone who had already ruled out the obvious ones. She could refuse the assignment. Refusal without credible cause would create exactly the kind of scrutiny she had managed to avoid for a decade. She could develop a sudden illness. See, above. She could comply and pray that 10 years of practicing invisibility would hold through 3 days of proximity to the most perceptive beings in the kingdom. She looked down at her hands, at the faint luminescence in her fingertips that came and went like a pulse. She thought of Pip's silver-threaded eye. She thought of 7 children sleeping in a subcellar. You stay, she told herself, because you have to. And because you stay, you hold on. That is all there is. She pressed her palms flat to the table and felt the slight warmth travel outward into the wood, making the grain visible for just a moment, the secret life of the tree that the table had once been. You hold on, she told herself again. She did not convince herself entirely. The feast preparations transformed Ironveil's great hall into something that resembled warmth without quite achieving it. Torchlight, rushes fresh laid, the smell of roasted meat and pine resin used to mask the cold stone underneath. Greta moved through the organized chaos of it with her healer's kit over one shoulder, taking note of who was coughing, who had been drinking since midday, who was standing near the kitchen hearths not because they were cold, but because they were afraid. Dame Isolde found her in the corridor outside the buttery. The castle's head housekeeper was a woman of perhaps 60, built like a stone buttress, with silver hair pinned under a dark wimple, and eyes that had seen enough in their time to have stopped judging most things. She had lost a son in the purge, Greta knew. You could see it in the way she occasionally stopped in the middle of a task and looked at nothing for just a moment before continuing. A word, Dame Isolde said quietly. She pressed something into Greta's hand. A small talisman, birchwood, the bark still on it, tied with linen thread. The kind of thing travelers in the old stories used to carry. Greta looked at it. Her chest did something complicated. She knows. Not everything. But enough. You have been in this castle longer than most, Isolde said, straightening a hanging tapestry without looking at her. You are a sensible young woman. Tonight, be the least interesting person in the room. Can you do that? I've had 10 years of practice. Isolde glanced at her, quick, warm, something that in a different context might have been the beginning of a smile. Good. She moved away. Eat something first. You look like a person who's been forgetting to eat. Greta closed her fingers around the birchwood. Two women who know how to be quiet. She put the talisman in her pocket. Two different kinds of alone. The Inquisitor of the Sanctum arrived as though she had not come from anywhere in particular, but had simply always been in the room. Vessa Crane was 25. This was the first thing Greta registered. The youth of her, the wrongness of it. Because she moved like someone who had shed every unnecessary thing early and moved faster for it. She was beautiful in a precise, engineered way. Dark hair, light eyes, a smile she deployed with the accuracy of a carpenter using the right tool for the right joint. The second thing Greta registered was the glass vial at her throat. It hung on a simple chain, thumb-sized, sealed with wax. The liquid inside was the pale silver of a winter sky an hour before it snowed. Greta knew what that color was. She knew because she had seen it before. In herself, in the subcellar children, in the surface of her morning tea. It was the color of ethereal essence when it had been removed from the living thing that made it. It was the color of what was left after the killing. The vial swayed gently as Vessa moved through the room. When Vessa reached her, coincidence, the Inquisitor was greeting everyone. It trembled once. Marin, the healer. Vessa's smile was warm and specific, as though they had met before. I've heard remarkable things about your work. The Sanctum is deeply invested in exceptional healers. I'm curious about your methods. My methods are fairly conventional, Greta said. Of course they are. Vessa moved on. The vial at her throat was still. She didn't notice. Greta breathed carefully. The vial trembled when she reached my distance, and then it stilled. She was greeting 20 people at once. She didn't register which one it was for. She watched Vessa glide toward the high table. This was the last time she could rely on that. The young priest materialized beside her during the second course, appearing as young priests do, with an air of studied harmlessness that Greta found immediately more alarming than open hostility. He was perhaps 23, dark-eyed, soft-spoken, with the kind of face that inspired reflexive trust. He asked about her herbal preparations, with the specific, detailed interest of someone who had been told exactly which questions to ask. A test. She recognized the shape of it. He wants me to say something that can't be explained by ordinary knowledge. She talked about silverwort and wound sealing and the proper ratio of valerian to bark moss for sleep preparations. All of it true, all of it mundane. She watched his face carefully, the slight disappointment when she offered nothing he couldn't have found in any apothecary's handbook. He left. She watched him go. And then, just before he turned the corner and disappeared into the crowd, he stopped walking for just a moment. His shoulders shifted. Something moved in his expression that she caught only in profile, only for a heartbeat. A flash of something that looked, against all reasonable expectation, like regret. Interesting. She filed it away. Not comfortable with what he's doing. That's a crack in the foundation, if it's real. She did not see Lord Edric Vane approach. He simply appeared at her elbow, a young man of perhaps 25, with a careful face and the clothes of a lord who wanted to be taken as slightly less important than he was. "Healer Marin," he said. "Forgive the informality." He steered her, through no visible pressure, to a space beside the heavy curtains at the hall's edge. "I'll be direct," he said, "because I suspect you'll prefer it. I know you are not who you appear to be. I am not your enemy. My father kept the old records, the real ones, before the Sanctum revised them. I have been looking for evidence of what I believe for 3 years. I think the purge was a lie. I think the Sanctum manufactured the threat that justified it. And I think you can help me prove it." Greta looked at him for a long time. He was either exactly what he said he was, or the most sophisticated threat she had ever faced. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I expected that." He was not offended. "I'll be here for 3 days. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." He moved away, then paused. The vial around Crane's neck. "Keep your distance. It vibrates at ethereal presence within 10 feet. He walked back into the feast without looking back. "He just gave me useful information, for free." She pressed her fingers briefly to her own sternum, feeling her heartbeat underneath. Either he's genuine, or that was the most elegant piece of bait I've ever been offered. Both possibilities required the same response. Careful. She found out later, from the shape of it, from context, that she had been watched throughout the meal. At the time, she only knew that her skin maintained a low, constant awareness of the high table. The way you remain aware of a fire in a room without looking at it directly. She focused on her work. Water levels, a lord's persistent cough, a merchant guest with hands that trembled on his cup. Brennan told Caelan, "She's hiding something." Caelan drank his wine and said, "I know." "Then you should—" "I know." Again, the same cadence. "The question is why I don't want to find out." This was the exchange as Brennan recounted it later. At the time, she only felt the weight of being observed by someone who had already decided not to act on what he saw, which was in some ways more unnerving than being hunted. The feast was half over when Vesa rose. She did it with the perfect ease of someone who had calculated the moment. Enough wine and enough people, enough noise in the room, attention diffuse and floating. She produced the vial from her chain and held it up. "A gift from the Sanctum," she said pleasantly. "A blessing water. I would be honored to share it with our generous host's guests." She began moving between the tables, a drop on each extended palm. Greta was calculating. 10 feet. Vane's warning. The vial would react before Vesa reached her. She had perhaps 40 seconds. Then Caelan stood up. He did it without theater. He stood, and the room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when the largest gravitational force in them shifts. "Inquisitor Crane?" His voice was even, pleasant, completely opaque. "I'm not familiar with this custom." Vesa turned, still smiling. "It's traditional in 'my guests are my guests.'" He was not loud. He was not sharp. He was simply the temperature of deep winter, the kind of cold that doesn't threaten. It just is. Their health and well-being is my responsibility. I would not want any blessing applied without my knowledge. A beat. Put it away. The smile stayed in place. The vial disappeared inside Vessa's collar. She returned to her seat with the smooth grace of someone who had encountered this kind of obstacle before and already knew how to go around it. When she sat down, she glanced once, briefly, along the length of the hall. Not at Caelan, at Greta. Before the feast ended, Edric Vane stood and addressed the hall. "I would be honored," he said, "to begin the blessing myself, as guest of longest tenure." He extended his palm to Vessa with a courtly smile. "Pour freely, Inquisitor." A drop of silver liquid hit his skin. Nothing happened. He turned his palm upward so the hall could see it clearly, then looked directly at Greta across the room. "Healer Marin, shall we be the representatives of the castle staff?" The room's attention followed his. He's establishing precedent. She understood it immediately. If I volunteer, it's voluntary. If I refuse a voluntary gesture in public, it draws suspicion. He's giving me an out. She moved through the crowd to Vane, extended her palm, and felt Caelan's eyes find her, like a compass needle finding north, even though she did not look at the high table. And then the feast ended, and Vessa had no grounds to push further. The corridor outside was cold. Greta walked through it and kept walking until she reached her apothecary and could close the door behind her. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. Her shadow, she noticed, pointed back toward the great hall. An hour after midnight, Greta stood in the castle's old armory. It was technically off-limits to the household staff, but the door had a lock she'd picked on her third day at Ironveil out of simple curiosity, and the room had been her thinking place ever since. The walls held weapons old enough that their makers had been dead for 200 years. Iron that had learned to smell like rust and cold stone and the memory of purpose. She had come here because the walls were thicker than anywhere else in the castle, because sound didn't travel through them, because she needed time to reseal the ward she could feel fraying at the edges of herself. She had come here also because she had not thought. Caelan was already inside. He stood in the center of the room with his back to the door, running his thumb along the flat of a double-edged sword that had hung on this wall since before either of them was born. His outer coat was gone. His shirt was loose at the collar, the sleeve of his injured shoulder rolled back. In the torchlight, he was all shadow and gray stone and— she had been correct. 10 years of careful not looking had not actually prepared her for looking. Something that completely eluded her available vocabulary. Handsome was a word for manageable things, she thought. He is not manageable. "I knew you'd come here," he said, without turning around. "The walls are thickest in this corner of the castle, and no one else ever comes here." She should have left. He was blocking no exit. She had simply stopped moving. He turned around. His eyes were the dark gray of deep water before a storm, and in them she saw not accusation, not triumph. The patient look of someone who had been waiting a long time for a conversation he had not been able to force. "You've been avoiding me for 5 years, he said. "I don't know what—" "Yes," he said, "you do." She was quiet. In the silence, she heard the torch burning. She heard the distant sound of the castle settling. "I have come to the apothecary wing," he said, simply, as though reporting weather conditions. 43 times in 5 years. On 17 of those occasions, you were absent when you should have been working. On the other 26, you did not come into the corridor. He paused. He had not meant to count, she understood. He had counted anyway, when he realized it was systematic. "I've never told myself why I kept going back." Something caught in her chest. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because something changed today." A small pause. His voice dropped by a half-register. There were nights before the Northern Campaign. The night before, the early morning. when I walked that corridor because the smell of whatever you grow on that window ledge was the only thing that was not about strategy or bloodshed. He looked at the sword on the table. I never examined why. Greta stood with that for a moment. He crossed to the table and produced, from inside his shirt, a single folded piece of paper. She knew before he unfolded it what it would be. 15 names. Beside each name, a notation. Wound sealed in 4 hours. Impossible. Fever broke inside 1 hour. Fracture, confirmed by bone setter. Walked the following morning. And beside several, flowering pattern in dressing. I have not shown this to anyone, he said. He set it on the table between them. I have had it for 3 years. Why? Because I wanted to hear you explain it. The torchlight moved between them. He smelled of road dust and clean wool, and underneath that, very faintly, the iron and pine of someone who had been riding in cold weather for 5 days. And something else, something warm, controlled, a leashed and patient strength. He is not afraid of what this paper means, she understood. He is afraid of something else entirely. I'm not human, she said. She watched him hold that. He did not move. I know, he said. What are you? She showed him. Not everything, not the full release, not the blaze she could feel pressing against the inside of her skin. Just the edge of it. She raised her right hand and let the seal loosen at her fingertips, and 3 inches of pale silver light ran up from her nails to her first knuckle and held there for 4 seconds before she closed it down again. He looked at it, then at her face, not afraid. Not awed in the cheap sense of the word. Something more precise. The expression of someone who has been presented with a piece of evidence that answers a question they have been carrying for a very long time. Ethereal, he said. The last one. She lowered her hand. As far as I know, the Sanctum says they're all dead. The Sanctum is lying. He was quiet for a moment. Then, from the way his expression shifted, from careful to something slightly more unguarded, she understood that this was not a surprise to him. He had suspected the lie. He had simply needed confirmation. My father was murdered, he said, by the same people who are sleeping in my guest wing tonight, to put a more manageable king on the throne. He sat down on the edge of the table, the first unguarded gesture she had seen from him, and it transformed his presence from monument to person, in a way that was, in its own way, more difficult to look at. I came back early from the Northern campaign because I had intelligence that the Sanctum was sending Crane, specifically. Her vial is not merely a detection instrument. It also contains records, a map, a roster of which bloodlines were not fully eradicated. He looked at her. Now I know why they sent her. The wolf bond, he said, after a silence. It complicates things. He was looking at his own hands, the knuckles slightly white. The original curse, or blessing, depending on who you ask, was bound to a bloodline oath from the 9th century. The wolves that bonded with the first Duskmores were the old kind, before the purges. Before there were no more ethereals to balance the bond. She understood what he was not saying. The bond is unstable, she said. It has been unstable for 60 years. Each king in my line has had less control than the one before. He looked up. I have more than my father did. I don't know why. I don't know how much longer it will hold. As though the speaking of it had loosened something, she saw it. A shift in the air around him, a thickening at the edge of his shadow. The shadow was wrong suddenly, slightly too large, the wrong shape, flickering between the shadow of a man and the shadow of something enormous crouched behind him. She crossed the room. She did not think about it. The movement was as involuntary as the movement of water toward the lowest point. She placed her hand flat against his chest, over his sternum, where she could feel the wolf bond as a heat beneath the bone, a coiled and pressurized thing straining against its own containment. She let something move through her palm. Not much. A steadying, the way you brace a wall that is not falling yet, but could. The heat beneath her hand subsided. The shadow behind him settled back into the shape of a man. She became aware that she was standing very close to him, that his hand had come up and wrapped around her wrist, not stopping her, not moving her, just holding the contact in place. Both of them were very still. "How long has it been that bad?" she said. Her voice was quiet. 2 years. Worse this season. "I can help with that," she said, "if you'll let me." He looked at her over the top of her head. She was near enough now that she would have had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She didn't. She kept her hand where it was and felt his heartbeat slow by degrees, the wolf subsiding into its den. "Why?" he said. "Because I am what I am," she said. "And because you are what you are. And apparently these two things are not unrelated." She stepped back. His hand fell from her wrist. The air between them was different from the air in the rest of the room. Warmer, charged with something that had no proper name in any language she knew. She had meant to leave. She had a perfectly serviceable exit strategy. She had been moving toward the door, and then she heard herself say, "My sister is the one who is coming." She stopped. He said nothing. "The thing that killed your informants on the northern road. The thing that Crane's vial reacts to, even when it's not me." She heard her own voice, doing what it did when she was being accurate instead of careful. Flat, dry, without emotion, as a way of containing emotion. The purge didn't kill all the ethereals, because one of them survived by drinking the essence of the ones they killed. What the Sanctum extracted and collected and put in those vials. The Sanctum made her. She was my sister before they made her. And now she is the thing they use to find the rest of us. And she's looking for you. She's always looking for me. I don't know if she still knows who I am. I don't know if she's doing this by choice. That is the question I've been carrying for 10 years. Her voice was level. She had practiced this. Kill or save. I don't know which. I don't know if I could do either one. The armory was very quiet. The torch had burned low. "You have been carrying that alone," Caelan said. There was no one else. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, the formality was gone entirely, just a man's voice in a cold room. "There is now," he said. She did not look at him. She looked at the old swords on the wall instead. All those weapons that had outlasted every hand that had ever used them. Above them, somewhere in the upper castle, glass broke. And then, a smell. Sulfur and old ash, and something else. A cold, hollow sweetness, like a flower preserved past the point of living. Seraphel had come to Ironveil. She was still beautiful. That was the cruelest part of it. Greta had prepared herself, over 10 years, for the sight of something unrecognizable. What came through the third-floor corridor window moved with Seraphel's exact grace, settled Seraphel's exact expression into its features, carried Seraphel's exact voice, like a weapon sheathed in silk. "Little sister." Seraphel stopped in the corridor, 10 feet away, and did not move closer. Her eyes were the places where eyes had been, still, reflective, opaque as polished obsidian. "I have been looking for you for a very long time." "I know." Greta stood her ground. Behind her, she could feel this without turning. Caelan had stopped in the doorway. "You're not going to touch me right now. We're going to talk." "Of course." Seraphel's voice was perfectly modulated, precise and familiar, and wrong in a way that lived in the chest rather than the ear. "I don't want to hurt you. I've never wanted to hurt you." They forced the first drinking. After the first, the choice was different. She looked at her own hand, the fingers translucent at the tips in the torchlight. "I am running out of time. The essence doesn't sustain the way it used to." The stillness in her eyes broke, just for a moment, into something human and frantic and exhausted. "If it comes willingly, if you give it freely, the old texts say it can reverse the corruption. I don't know if that's true. I want the chance to find out.
Brennan arrived at a run, Caelan 2 steps behind him. He had his sword half drawn before Caelan's hand came up. "Don't." Brennan looked at Greta, at the thing in the corridor that wore her sister's face. At Greta again, the way she was standing, spine straight, hands at her sides, not backing away. He lowered the sword. It was such a small thing, just a soldier choosing to sheathe a weapon, buying someone else the space to make a choice. But in the corridor light, watching Greta hold her ground between two impossible things, something in Brennan's face had changed. "She's not a threat," his expression said. "She's something else entirely." He stepped back, put his shoulder to the wall, and covered the staircase with the posture of a man who has decided what he's guarding. "I don't know if I can give what you're asking," Greta said. "I know. I don't know if I trust that it would help you instead of, I know." Seraphel's voice was very quiet. "I am not asking you to be certain. I'm asking you to consider it. I chose to survive. You know that. I have never told myself it was noble. But I am still... There is still something in here that remembers the birch forest where we grew up. That remembers making the tea in the mornings." Her head tilted slightly. "Is that enough? For you to give it the chance to survive?" Greta looked at her sister. She felt Caelan behind her, not intervening, not speaking. Present. The warmth of his presence at the edge of her awareness, steady as a fixed point. She reached out her hand, and Vesa Crane came down the corridor with 4 armed soldiers, and the moment shattered. "Seize them both." Seraphel moved. Not an attack. She dissolved, the way smoke dissolves, pulling inward and vanishing through the window she'd come through, leaving only that cold flower scent behind. Greta did not run. She turned. Vesa's soldiers were between her and the staircase. Vesa herself stood at the corridor's end, with her vial uncapped, silver light dripping from its mouth. The expression on her face that of a craftsperson who has waited a long time to use the right tool. Caelan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his hand. He simply stepped into the space between Greta and Vesa's soldiers, and was there. And the corridor reorganized itself around that fact. "You are in my castle," he said, "attempting to seize a member of my household without my authorization. Put your weapons away." "She is ethereal, my lord. The Sanctum has no jurisdiction in Aethermoor." His voice was even, factual, cold as the floor beneath them. "You are guests here. Act accordingly." Vesa stared at him, then at Greta. Her eyes moved between them with the precision of someone doing mathematics. "You already knew," she said. The answer to the question wasn't what she was really asking. She was calculating. How long, how deep, how thoroughly her plan had been compromised before she'd even begun. He said nothing. The soldiers sheathed their weapons. Vesa recapped her vial with a motion of controlled precision and retreated down the corridor, with the dignity of someone who has lost this particular engagement and already moved on to planning the next one. When she reached the corner, she glanced back once. Not at Caelan, at Greta. It was not hatred in her eyes, it was calculation. Greta found him by accident. She was returning from the corridor, taking the longer route back, and there was the priest, Dorian, standing in a servant's alcove with his back against the wall and his eyes on the floor. His hands were shaking. Not violently, the fine, contained trembling of a person who is keeping themselves together with effort. He looked up when she approached. She had expected to feel fear. She felt, instead, something more like recognition. "You were going to report to her," she said. "Yes." His voice was almost inaudible. "Did you?" A long pause. "Not tonight." She waited. "My father's village was taken in the name of Sanctum protection," he said, carefully, as though the words were breakable. "They took the land, they took the buildings. They left the people, which they considered generous. I joined too.
I thought if I could change it from inside. He stopped. What I saw tonight was not something I can write in a report. What did you see tonight? A woman, standing still between a monster and a soldier, he said, who wasn't running. She left him standing in the alcove. At the corridor's end, she heard Brennan's voice behind her, quiet but clear. You need anything? The first time he had spoken to her that was not a question or a challenge. Not tonight, she said, but thank you.
The fire in the apothecary's small hearth was burning low when Caelan came through the door. She had not invited him. She had also, she was aware, not locked it. He sat down in the chair beside the fire, her chair, not the patient's stool, which was a small transgression she noted and decided not to mention. He leaned back. He stretched his legs out. He looked at the fire with the expression of a man who has spent the last several hours being a king and has temporarily run out of the resources to continue. She kept working. The silver bark moss needed stripping. It was repetitive work that occupied her hands while her mind did other things. You can go back to your chambers, she said. I'm aware. A pause. You don't want to. No. She stripped another strand of bark. The fire crackled. Outside, the birch forest stood invisible in the dark, waiting for morning. Ask me something, she said, because the silence was taking on a weight she wasn't sure she could manage. Why valerian root in the morning tea? He said it without hesitation, which meant he'd been thinking it for some time. Valerian is a sleep herb. In high doses. In very small amounts, it suppresses the spike in ethereal essence that comes with dreams. She moved to the next strand. I dream about light. If I'm not careful, things happen to objects in the room. What kind of things? Growing, living things, even wood that's been dead a long time. Remember what they were. She glanced at the table. The chair you're sitting in was an oak once. Some mornings I wake up and find small leaves. He looked down at the armrests. Then, a motion she hadn't predicted, a quiet, genuine surprise from a man who had seemed constitutionally immune to it. The corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile, exactly. The shape of one, the memory of one. She looked away. She woke to cold and birdsong. The fire had gone to coals. In the chair beside it, Caelan was asleep. Head tilted back, one arm along the armrest, the severity of his face entirely absent in unconsciousness. He looked younger. He looked like a person rather than a king, which was a distinction she was apparently incapable of not noticing. She had covered him with her cloak at some point. She didn't remember doing it. She was sitting on the floor beside the herb table, with her knees drawn up, and the morning light was coming through the window onto the silver bark moss she'd been sorting, and she had, evidently, slept. She looked at her window ledge, the 7 small clay pots. She looked at the man asleep in her chair. She should have been afraid. This was objectively a worse situation than any she had been in for years. The Inquisitor was awake and calculating. Her sister had been driven away, but not far. Everything she had held in place for 10 years was shifting. She felt, instead, something she couldn't name at first, because she had not felt it in so long that the shape of it was unfamiliar. Less alone. Dangerous, she told herself. I know, she answered herself. He opened his eyes, found her immediately, as though she had been the last thing he was aware of before sleeping, and picking up from there required no adjustment. His eyes in the morning light were still gray-dark, and then, just for a moment, as they focused on her face, she saw it. A flicker of amber deep in the iris, gold as firelight, there and gone in a single breath. She filed that away somewhere she didn't examine. You covered me, he said. It was cold. You could have left. He said it carefully. You stayed. She looked at her pots. There are people I can't leave behind. The children. He sat up, looked at the window ledge with the attention of someone learning to read a language.
They're the reason you haven't run. A pause. They're not the only reason, now.
She did not answer. She didn't need to.
If I told you I would protect you, he said, would you believe me? No alpha has ever protected an ethereal. Say my name. She looked at him, this close, and she had somehow, between sleep and morning, ended up not on the floor, but in the second chair, near enough that they were speaking at a volume meant only for the two of them. She could see the slight shift in him when he said it, the deliberate lowering of something he ordinarily held raised. Caelan, she said. Something in his face settled. I'm not asking you about other alphas, he said. I'm asking you about me. She was quiet. Outside, the castle was beginning to wake. The kitchens, the distant sound of the guard changing. The ordinary morning of a place that didn't know what had happened in it overnight. I'm afraid, she said finally, of what I'll do when I see her again. Your sister. She is the only family I have ever had. She looked at her hands. I'm afraid that given the choice between saving her and saving everyone else, I won't be able to make the right one. That's the thing I've never said out loud. A pause. I don't know if the right choice is what I think it is. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he said, You are not the only one with something they've been carrying alone. She looked up. You're not alone in it anymore, he said. Simple as a statement of geography. That's what I'm telling you. She held that for a moment, the weight of it, the impossible, relieving weight of it. Dorian knocked at the apothecary door at midday. He stood in the corridor with the expression of a person who has spent a night deciding something and arrived looking both resolved and exhausted. He had, for 3 days, been feeding Vesa Crane information about castle movements, staff schedules, which corridors were unguarded at what hours. He laid it all out with the flat, specific honesty of someone doing penance. Then he told her what Vesa was planning. Reinforcements would arrive in 48 hours. 50 soldiers, Sanctum trained. There's something else, he said. The real records. Lord Vane has them. The original accounts from before the Sanctum's revision. I saw the summary once, when Crane sent me to search his quarters. He looked at the floor. It was not what we were told. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because I have spent 3 years telling myself that the work I was doing was necessary. And last night I watched a woman stand still between a monster and a sword. And I understood that I had been using necessary as a word that meant comfortable. He paused. I'd like to be useful in a different way, if you'll let me. Edric Vane arrived an hour after Dorian, with a leather document case that he set on her table and opened without ceremony. The records inside were 3 generations old, written in 3 different hands. She read the summary in 4 minutes. The ethereals did not attack the Sanctum. The truth was the opposite. An ethereal healer had revealed, publicly, that the Sanctum's protective blessing compounds were harvested from non-consenting living sources. The Sanctum had moved to erase that knowledge. The purge was not protection. It was erasure of a witness. She set the paper down. I've had this for 3 years, Edric said. I needed you to exist. To corroborate that the thing they erased was real. He looked at her steadily. I'm sorry it took this long. Brother Aldrich came to her that evening. Not to deliver news. He sat in the patient's stool, the first time she had ever seen him sit in it, and looked at the floor for a moment. 20 years I have been in this castle, he said. In 20 years I have seen exactly 1 person who could seal a fracture by touching it. 1 person whose dressings grew flowers. He looked up. I stopped asking questions because I decided that, whatever you were, you had chosen to be here. And the people you helped were real. He paused. I'm sorry I was never able to say that to you directly. He put his hand on her shoulder and stood up. I have been waiting, he said, to see the day you did not have to be alone in it. He left.
She sat with the warmth of his hand on her shoulder for a long time. Caelan, Brennan, Edric, and Greta stood around the apothecary table, with Dorian's information and Edric's documents between them. 48 hours, Caelan said. Before the reinforcements arrive, Crane has to act, or she goes back to the Sanctum having confirmed an ethereal's presence and done nothing about it. We need her to act publicly, in a way that's documented, witnessed, and legally indefensible. His eyes moved to Greta. I need everything you know. All of it. She told him. All of it. The bond she'd felt since he'd arrived, the children in the subcellar, the real mechanics of what she was and what Aethermoor had become. She watched his face for the moment when it would become too much. It did not become too much. When she finished, he nodded once. Then here is what we do. He outlined it in a few concise sentences. The courtyard, the open space, the witnesses already positioned. A trap baited with exactly what Vesa wanted. The plan was elegant and dangerous, and depended entirely on Greta standing in the open and not running. Brennan's shoulder pressed briefly against hers as he reached past her to point at the map on the table. Deliberate or not, she didn't know, but she understood what it meant. You're in the room. You're in the plan. You're not the problem being solved. She was part of the solving. She came alone. Greta had been waiting in the east courtyard with the specific, practiced stillness of someone who had decided to stop running from a thing and was now simply waiting for it to arrive. The cold was the honest cold of northern autumn, no pretense in it. Aethermoor materialized from the shadow of the outer wall, and for the first time in 10 years, Greta could see clearly what she was. Not a monster, not a weapon, not the enemy the Sanctum had made her. A woman at the absolute end of her resources, her edges translucent in the moonlight, her expression stripped of everything but exhaustion and a terrible, focused hope. I can't fight anymore, Aethermoor said. Her voice was Aethermoor's voice. That was still there, the voice that had said, run in the dark. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking for the chance to end this the way I choose. What happens if I give you essence freely? The old texts say... She stopped. I don't know. I think it cleans what was done to me. I think what comes after is different from what I am now. She looked at her own hands, translucent to the second knuckle. Less. That might mean death. I know. I chose survival at any cost once. I'm choosing differently now. Greta looked back. Caelan was against the courtyard wall, still, saying nothing. He had been there when she arrived. He would not interfere. He had made that clear. He met her eyes. This is what it means to have someone in the room, she thought. Not rescue, not intervention, just, I am here. Whatever you choose it knowing someone is behind you. She turned back to her sister. She lifted her hand. Vesa came through the courtyard gate with 6 soldiers and her vial uncapped. She had been watching. Of course she had. The courtyard was exactly where the Inquisitor wanted them. Open. Documented. A public act that couldn't be denied. What she had not accounted for was Aethermoor. In the fraction of a second before the soldiers reached her, Aethermoor turned into light. Not a choice, not a weapon, but a final burning. Every scrap of harvested essence in her body releasing at once. The desperate last flare of a flame that has consumed all its fuel. A pillar of cold silver fire lit the courtyard like a second moon. Uncontrolled, exhausted, her body's absolute last. Caelan released the wolf. Not fully. Enough. The shadow behind him split into something vast and dark and ancient. Amber light burning where his eyes had been, and the soldiers froze in place. Brennan was already moving along the wall, cutting off Vesa's retreat. The vial at Vesa's throat shattered from the resonance. The silver liquid fell. In the freezing air of the courtyard, it rose as light. Vesa was fast. From inside her coat, she produced a length of chain.
White platinum threaded through iron alloy rings, the Sanctum's oldest working, specifically engineered to suppress a wolf bond. And she had it around Caelan's wrists before Brennan could reach her. The wolf went dark.
Caelan was on his knees, the courtyard stones at his hands, his face controlled with the specific discipline of someone managing enormous pain through sheer will. He looked up at Greta, his eyes, still gray, still steady, and in their depths something gold that hadn't been there before, burning quiet as a coal. "Do what you came here to do," his face said. "I'm fine." She had known about the walls for years. She had understood them in her third winter at Ironveil, when she'd pressed her hand against the foundation stone during a fever dream and felt the castle breathe back. The castle's name was not decorative. The original builder had understood what was under the mountain Ironveil stood on, a network of stone that had been here before the mountain, before the kingdom, before the first human had walked this part of the world. The ethereals who had built here had woven something into the granite, not a weapon, not a ward, but a balance. A way for the world's living essence to breathe in and breathe out without building to crisis. It had not been used in a very long time. It needed something to connect to. She knelt and pressed both palms flat to the courtyard stone. The stone was cold. Then it was warm. Then it was alive. Light moved outward from her hands in silence. Not an explosion, not a blaze, but a tide. Slow, deep. The way a tide is slow and deep. It ran along the seams in the granite where the old builders had laid their work, found the network of connective stone beneath the walls, and began to move through Ironveil as though the castle itself were exhaling for the first time in 60 years. Vessa's remaining instruments dissolved. The chains on Caelan's wrists cracked and fell. Seraphel, what was left of Seraphel, was already in the light, not fighting, not held, dissolving into it, the way water dissolves into water. Clean, finally, free. The castle was different in the morning. Nothing visible had changed, and everything had. The walls breathed. The birch trees at the forest's edge were luminous with the particular light of very early morning, and every stone in the courtyard had a faint warmth to it, as though the cold had been persuaded to leave the building, and had complied without argument. Vessa's soldiers had put down their weapons before dawn. Several of them sat in the great hall with the dazed and quiet expression of people who had been carrying a heavy thing for a very long time, and had simply, finally, set it down. In the courtyard, where Seraphel had been, where the silver light had risen and spread and dissipated into the stone, a small birch sapling was growing. It had not been there the night before. It was perhaps 18 inches tall, pale-barked and tentative, its few leaves translucent in the early light. Greta stood looking at it for a long time. She had expected grief to feel different, larger or louder or more violent. Instead, it was this: a small tree where her sister used to be, in a courtyard that smelled of frost and old stone and something new underneath both. She chose this. The thought was careful and painful and ultimately bearable. She chose how it ended. That was hers. She crouched down and pressed her hand briefly to the sapling's thin trunk. Something warm moved back against her palm. "Yes," it seemed to say, "still here." She heard him before she saw him, not his footstep, but the shift in the air that his presence created, the change in temperature she had learned to feel and never quite learned to ignore. Then his hands were around her, and she was upright, and he was holding her with the arms of a man who has been afraid and is no longer afraid, and needs the not afraid to be something real and physical rather than abstract. His chin was at the top of her head. His heartbeat against her ear was very loud. She stood still for a moment. Then, slowly, her hands found the fabric of his shirt. "You scared me," he said, very quietly, for her only. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize." His arms tightened. "Just don't do it again." "I can't promise that."
I know. I'll be here, regardless. She felt it then, a warmth at her temple, close to where his heartbeat was. And when she finally tilted her head back to look at him, his eyes were gold. Not a flicker, not a trick of morning light. Gold, the color of deep amber, the color of a fire that has finally found the wood it was always meant to burn. He looked at her, looking at him. Neither of them said anything. Aldrich brought the children up from the subcellar at midday. 7 of them, blinking in the winter sunlight, wrapped in borrowed cloaks and carrying the slightly dazed expression of people who have slept better than they have in years. Pip ran directly to Greta and attached herself to her leg. The others hung back in the uncertain way of children who are trying to determine whether they are allowed to be happy yet. The silver thread in Pip's eye was gone. Greta crouched down and looked at each face, one by one. In each pair of eyes, stable, clear. Whatever had been pressing against the edges of them had been balanced overnight. "Marin," Tam said, in his serious, older child voice. "The walls are warm." "I know. Did you do that?" She looked at him. "We did that," she said. "All of us." When she looked up, Caelan was at the staircase, looking down at the courtyard. The expression on his face was the unguarded one, the one that lived underneath the rest of it. He was not watching her, he was watching the children. Learning the shape of a thing he had not previously allowed himself to look at. She did not look away quickly enough. He caught her looking. Neither of them said anything. In the corridor behind him, Dame Isolde stood quietly in the doorway, a linen cloth in her hands. She caught Greta's eye across the distance of the courtyard. Just once. Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile and did not need to be. She turned back inside. Edric presented the documents in the Great Hall, the original accounts, the testimony of 3 witnesses from before the Purge, the record of what the ethereal healer had revealed and what the Sanctum had done in response. He presented them with the precision and relentlessness of a man who had waited 3 years to give this particular argument and was not going to waste the moment. Vesa sat and listened. Her vial was gone. The instruments she had traveled with were dissolved or shattered. She sat in her chair with her hands flat on the table, and her face carrying the expression of someone who has had the ground removed from beneath their certainties and is in the process of determining whether they will rebuild on the same site or find different ground. At the end, Caelan said, 30 days. To return to the Sanctum with this record. To present your testimony, or refuse to. To decide what kind of person you are going to be next. The option to be useful remains open. So does the option to leave Aethermoor and not return. I am not in the business of forcing outcomes. Vesa looked at him, then at Greta. She said nothing. She left with her delegation before sunset, quietly, and without the vial. She did not realize it was going to happen until it was already happening. The household had gathered in the Great Hall without particular ceremony, the natural aggregation of people after a shared crisis, the kind of gathering that happens when people need to be in the same room for a while to confirm that everyone is still there. Aldrich was dispensing soup. Brennan was managing the complicated logistics of who was sleeping where now that the guest wing had emptied. Dorian was in a corner, very quietly, writing something. A letter, she thought, to a superior who was not going to enjoy receiving it. Caelan stood at the edge of the room. When he spoke, his voice was not raised, and yet the hall went quiet. From this day, the woman you know as Marin, whose name is Greta, stands under the protection of the crown of Aethermoor. He said it with the flat, documented finality of a man enacting a law, rather than making a speech. Any hand raised against her answers to me. Any authority that claims jurisdiction over her answers to me. Ironveil's doors are open to any person whose nature this kingdom has historically called monstrous and treated accordingly. This is not a proclamation. It is a description of how things are going forward. He looked at her across the room. And if you'll stand beside me. The formality dropped. Just his voice then. Just the thing underneath the king, speaking to the thing underneath the healer. Not behind, beside. She looked at him for a long time. "I won't be obedient," she said. "I know. I will argue with you. Frequently, I expect. And if you're wrong, Greta." Her name in his mouth, her real name, for the first time since the armory. Greta. Not a title, not a disguise. The actual word for who she was. "Give me your hand." She crossed the room. She put her hand in his. 3 months later, the birch sapling in the courtyard was taller. Nobody had transplanted it. Nobody had watered it especially, or noted its growth in a record, or tried to explain it. It had simply grown, because that was what it was, and the stone around it had accommodated. Aethermoor was changing, slowly, imperfectly, with the frustrating, incremental quality of things that change, because they need to, rather than because anyone has decided they should. Aldrich was training 3 new apprentices, 2 of them young women who had been turned away from other positions. The subcellar children had rooms now, on the 3rd floor, and Tam had begun asking Edric vain questions about law that Edric was apparently answering with genuine engagement. Tam's strange growth, finally steadying now that the essence inside him had found its balance. Dorian had not returned to the Sanctum. He was living in a village 2 hours east of Ironveil, and had, with a directness that Greta found she respected, started writing down the things he had witnessed in the service of institutions he no longer served. Vesa came back on a gray morning in midwinter, alone. No retinue, no vial. She stood at Ironveil's gate with the expression of someone who has traveled a long way to say one sentence and wants to say it before her nerve fails. And if you want more stories like this one, the kind with real stakes, slow burns, and characters who earn every single moment, hit subscribe and come back. I make these for people who actually feel stories, not just watch them. Thank you for being here. It genuinely means something.